Welcome to my paper, Shelter from the Storm, the Importance of Buildings for Protecting Agricultural Produce. I'd like to thank the British Archaeological Association for the opportunity to present my research to its members and the wider public. Agricultural produce enabled the construction of the magnificent buildings of medieval Europe. The sale of produce provided lords with the wealth to invest in their residences and to patronise churches, cathedrals and monasteries. The volume of agricultural produce also allowed the sustenance of teams of builders and other construction trades. Thus, the storage and protection of agricultural produce was vital for everyday life and the construction of these buildings. To this end, lords constructed barns, granaries, and animal houses on their manors. Wealthier peasants also constructed similar buildings, often a single multi-purpose structure to protect their grain and animals. Often these buildings were studied from an economic viewpoint, with scholars such as Slavin considering if the investment in their construction and maintenance offset the losses of grain due to dampness and rot. As with so many aspects of medieval life, it is likely that these simple and mundane buildings served a multitude of functions, being both functional and symbolic. For when we come to look at these structures, we'll see that many were far from plain, functional buildings we picture today when we think about agricultural buildings. In this paper, I'll give an overview of the types of buildings present within British manorial complexes, their appearance and their importance to agriculture and society. We shall begin by looking at animal housing, followed by crop storage. The range of animal houses present on a manor was related to what was needed for the type of agriculture that was practiced on that manor. Housing for cows, oxen, sheep and horses were the most common and were found in most manors. Sheep houses were found in most manors. Wool was a valuable export and the care of sheep was important to protect the wool. Sheep houses were sometimes located within the manorial curia, as depicted in the Duke of Berry's Book of Hours, shown here, but more often they were grouped together in complexes known as Berryries, which gave access to the pasture fields and upland grazing. The manor of Alceston in East Sussex demonstrates this relationship between the curia, the Berkery and the upland grazing. Dyer mapped many sheep cots in Gloucestershire and showed that they were long structures with occasional small annexes. The French text Le Bon Berger in 1379 by Jean de Brie recommends that sheep be housed overnight throughout the year, so easy access to the sheepcot was important. The previous image from Duke of Berry's Book of Hours is very similar to the shape of the sheepcot surveyed by Dyer, being long and narrow, with one or two entrances. However, the details we gain from the manorial accounts and references in Le Bon Berger suggest that these were more substantial structures with doors and windows that could be secured closed, such as these examples on the screen here. Dyer has shown how the size of sheepcots varies considerably. However, we cannot tell what influenced the size differences. It may have been related to the number of sheep on the manor or change in the amount of space given to the sheep. Here we can turn to manorial accounts and look at the expenditure on new sheep houses across the 14th century. The accounts record the construction of several new sheep houses. This allows us to look at the relationship between the size of sheep houses and the size of flock over time. Although the accounts do not provide us with the size of the houses, they do provide the cost, and we can use this to indicate the size relative to other sheep houses constructed during the century. We can adjust the costs of the buildings in relation to inflation. This was done using indices calculated from Clark's data for wages and prices over the 14th century. This inflation accounted for the different proportions of the work that were made up of the expenditure on wages and materials. Once this has been graphed, as you can see here, we can see that there was a much higher expenditure in the later 14th century. As we know this was not a result of increasing prices and wages, we can only assume that it was due to an increase in the size of the sheep houses. There was an increase in the flock size in the 1350s, but it quickly returned to just above pre-Black Death levels. This increase in the size of flocks may have had an influence on lords as they built new sheep houses with the intention of having a large flock. The average flock size depicted here blurs the variation in individual manors. In some years, a manor could massively increase its flock, such as at Redgrave in East Anglia, where there were 162 sheep in 1377, 451 in 1340, and 729 in 1343. Redgrave is one of the manors that constructed a new sheep house, but it waited until 1345, when its flock was over 4 times larger than it had been just 6 years earlier. Therefore, we can suggest that the construction and increased size of these sheep houses show that lords were more concerned with the welfare and living conditions of their sheep than they had been in the first half of the 14th century. Housing for cows and oxen were found within the curia. There are occasional references to vaccaries, which are specialised complexes for housing and milking cows, but they are not as common as burkeries. These buildings provide protection to animals, particularly when they were calving. Ox houses were important because the oxen needed particular care and extra feed to ensure that they were healthy and strong when ploughing and harrowing the land. There is limited archaeological evidence for such buildings. Earthworks on the North Yorkshire moors and Pennines have been interpreted as vaccaries belonging to Malton Abbey and Bolton Priory. However, we cannot tell much about the structures. The excavation of a cowhouse at Tynemouth Priory revealed a 20-foot wide building with a paved drain along the centre, allowing for 2 rows of stalls separated by timber partitions. The documentary references indicate structures similar to sheep houses, being mainly timber framed and roofed with thatch, although stone versions did exist. They also had windows and doors, and the doors were always fitted with locks to secure them closed. Stables were found on most manors and were common on other high-status complexes such as castles, palaces, and colleges. There were 2 types of stables identified in medieval documents, those for riding horses and those for working horses. Manorial accounts provide descriptions of the various stables of the manor, such as the Lord's stable, Palfrey stable, Stotty stable, and the Great stable. The Lord's stable and Palfrey stable were for riding horses, whereas the Stotty stable were for working horses. The accounts suggest that the stables were constructed from different materials and would therefore have appeared quite different to the viewer. The riding stables were more likely to have been stone and roofed with tiles, while the working stables were timber framed and roofed with thatch. This differentiation of buildings is the first indication we have of different levels of protection for animals. The riding horses were more valuable and may have been provided with better quality housing to give them more protection from the weather. But this was probably also a decision to display the wealth of the manor to those visiting and having their horses housed within the stables. Another building that received particular attention was the dovecot. Doves were primarily a source of meat in the form of their young known as squabs. Unlike other birds of the manor, such as chickens and geese, which had small timber houses, doves were housed in large and costly structures called dovecots. These were constructed of both stone and timber, but there are very few surviving timber examples. The stone dovecots were large circular structures with alcoves built into the wall for the doves to nest in. In the centre was a ladder that could be moved around to access the alcoves and remove the squabs. Doves fed on grain grown in the fields and would sometimes peck at thatch roofing. This meant that they caused damage to property of the lord and his tenants, as the birds were indiscriminate when it came to choosing which furlongs to eat from. Because of this high expense, we find that dovecots were only located on manors where the lord was often resident, and access to meat was needed. It also made the dovecot a target for poachers trying to protect their crops and steal meat from the lord's table. Poaching may have been one of the reasons that dovecots were constructed from stone and were such large buildings, as it was hoped that this would protect the birds inside from attack. The cost, the threat of poaching, and the fact that keeping doves was a manorial privilege meant that dovecots were a symbol of wealth and lordship that was visible to the tenants and visitors of the manor. Doves also had a religious significance, representing purity and God. I think there's further work to be done thinking about the appearance of these birds circling the manorial buildings. I'm particularly reminded of Dr. Lizzie Swarbuck's paper in this British Archaeological session about bees flying around the spires of Rosslyn Chapel. I know of several castles with dovecots in their turrets, Bodingham being one example, and this may be more prevalent than we've realised, and it's definitely worth further investigation. In addition to animal housing, all manors had some form of crop storage. Barns were the most common and most versatile. Some manors also had granaries. In the post-medieval period, granaries were small buildings supported on staddle stones, which are mushroom-shaped stones that raised the building off the ground, protect it from dampness and vermin. However, there is no evidence that these stones were used in the Middle Ages. Granaries may have been part of other buildings within the curia, such as lofts within the doorways of barns or over chambers. Peasant houses kept their grain in lofts within their houses, and manorial hall complexes may have had a similar space to store grain. The warmth of the hall would have kept it dry and prevent it from going mouldy or being attacked by vermin. Barns are the medieval agricultural buildings that best survive to the present day. Many were large structures, such as Great Coxwell and Swalcliffe, but there was a range of sizes, with large and small standing together in the same curia. The majority that survives today were constructed of stone, but there are a few timber barns standing, such as Harmsworth and the barns of Cressing Temple. Barns were multifunctional spaces. They were primarily for the storage of harvested crops, but they were also used to store farming equipment, to house sheep for shearing, and even to hold a manorial court. The manorial accounts often name barns for the types of crop that they stored, such as the wheat barn, barley barn, pea barn. We can't tell if the same crop was stored in the barn from year to year, or if the name changed each year to reflect the contents. An additional complication in this respect is that we know multiple crops were stored in the same barn. Some documents describe various crops being piled up in the separate bays of the barn. This may have been the case on smaller manors where fewer barns existed. Stone barns were a huge investment for the manor or the estate. The barn of Longbridge Deverell, a manor of Glastonbury Abbey, cost about £28 in 1300, and New College's barn at Swalcliffe cost over £310 in 1401–7, with many materials coming from within the estate. Timber barns were between £2 and £12, meaning stone barns were at least twice the cost, and Swalcliffe was about 25 times. This may have been partly due to inflation, but may also have been related to the size difference. It has been thought that higher investment in stone barns was offset by a reduction in maintenance. It is true that they do not need repairs to the timber frame, but these were rare repairs on timber buildings. The majority of repairs are to doors, locks, and roofing, all of which continue in stone buildings. Many of the stone barns were constructed by the church or perpetual institutions, such as Oxford colleges. These are likely to have taken a much longer-term view of their buildings and could justify such a high investment. They presumed that their successors would still be using the building for generations in the future. Secular lords had less certainty over the future of their estate. Their succession was not guaranteed due to illness and war, and possession of their lands was at the mercy of the king. Therefore, they may have been less willing and less able to invest so much in their agricultural buildings of their manor. Barns may have been functional buildings, but they were not without decoration. This may have been at the request of the patron or the initiative of the stonemason. Decorative features survive on the stone barns, but timber buildings probably also had similar features that do not survive. The barn at Middle Littleton had very decorative finials along its roof. The corbels supporting the roof of Great Coxwell were decorated, and the main door to Swalcliffe was surrounded by dressed stone. These features are ostentatious or extravagant displays of wealth, but they do indicate that whoever constructed them had some interest in their appearance and their aesthetic. William Langland gives us a glimpse of the importance and symbolism of the barn in his poem Piers Plowman, when he uses the barn to represent unity, or Holy Church. In this passage, Grace gives Piers the materials to construct the barn, each material being associated with part of the Passion. It would be wrong to think that people in the Middle Ages saw this symbolism in every barn, but it does suggest that people would have associated the building with wider intangible concepts such as lordship and the authority of the church. The parallels in appearance between the church and the barn, which Langland draws on, would have been immediately apparent. The fact that the manorial court was sometimes held in the barn would have connected the social importance of the court with the barn. Thus, it would have connotations of manorial and religious authority over the tenants. Also, the tenants were bringing harvested crops into the barn as part of their labour services that they owed to their lord. This would have been a direct reminder of their position in society and the authority that the lord had over their lives. It's evident that barns were essential to the operation of the manorial agriculture, but simultaneously they represented the authority of the lord. A modern viewer would not immediately think that such a functional building was also highly symbolic for people in the Middle Ages. I'll now summarise and draw some conclusions. The range of buildings present on the manor and the level of investment in their construction and maintenance shows that lords took significant care of their animals and their arable produce. Ultimately, this was to ensure as much income as possible from the sale of their produce, but it's unlikely that the losses from poor storage and housing would have been as much as the cost of construction and maintenance of these buildings. It's also clear that there was different housing for various animals. We see this particularly with horses, where the more valuable riding horses were given higher quality housing. There would have been a clear visible difference between these two types of stables. One of the most important aspects of this study is the multiple functions of buildings, the combination of functional and symbolic aspects. Barns and dovecots are key examples that reflect the lord's authority over the manorial tenants, while also housing harvested crops and doves. Therefore, we should consider these agricultural buildings as serving many functions, particularly having a symbolic meaning as well as providing shelter from the weather. Thank you.